a student has to accept their ignorance before they can remove that ignorance. There's something that called compounded ignorance. There's a famous story. Bruce Lee used to tell this story, but it's a story that comes out of samurai tradition, actually, about a man who went to study with a master, and they're doing the tea, and he's telling him he learned this from so-and-so, and he learned this from so-and-so, and he learned that. And so the master just keeps pouring the tea until it overflows. And then the student says, why are you pouring the cup's full? And he said, what, it can't take any more? And he said, yeah. And he said, well, it seems that you're full also, so I don't know what I can teach you. Because you have to go to a teacher with a type of humility. And if you don't have that, you can't learn. I will remove my signs from people that have arrogance in the earth without any just right. And so humility is very important, of just maintaining a type of humility. Intellectual humility is important, spiritual humility. And there's, the story about the imam. He's in the mihrab and he kind of has an epiphany, falls down and starts saying, I'm nothing, I'm nothing. And the mu'adhin comes in, he says, the imam's nothing, what am I? He falls down, he says nothing. Then the guy who comes in, who sweeps the mosque out, he sees the imam and the mu'adhin. He's saying, they know the whole Quran by heart, I'm just ignorant. What am I? He falls down, he's saying, I'm nothing, I'm nothing. Then the imam says to the mu'adhin, look who thinks he's nothing. Right? So that's spiritual pride, which is a real problem, right? Okay, that's a Jewish joke that I just switched to imam. It's originally the rabbi and the cantor. But that's the nice thing about religious jokes. You can just change the names and they fit. So that's very important, is just humility. And also taqleed is a negative thing in our tradition, but it's a necessary thing for somebody who's ignorant, is just to have humility and recognize that they need to learn. And we should all try to learn. I think the most important things about this tradition is a lot of the basic principles they're very simple and universal. Like, for instance, if the Muslims just took one verse of Quran and applied it, we'd change the world. وَقُولُوا لِلنَّاسِ حُسْنًا. Speak beautifully to people. Like, if you just applied that one verse, or idfa' billati hiya ahsan, return a wrong with a right. You just apply. These are not hard things to understand. They're hard to implement, but they're not. Asta'inu bis-sabri was-salah. Seek help from God with patience and prayer. There's so many principles in the Quran like that. I'll give you one example of that. I was in Morocco and I was at a gas station. Somebody was filling gas, and I had a turban and a jalaba on. So this man thought that I was learned or something. So he came up to me. He was a gas station attendant. And he was a young man. He said, I'm studying at the university. I do this but he said, I have a philosophy teacher, and he's really confused me. I said, what did he say? He said that, everybody says, God created this, God created that, but it begs the question, who created God? And so I told him a hadith in Sahih Muslim that the Prophet ﷺ said, "La yazalu nas yatasa'alun." People will continue to philosophize. Because that's what philosophy is, asking questions. And they'll say, who created this? And the answer is Allah. And who created this? And the answer is Allah. Until somebody will say, who created Allah? And he said, if you hear that, say, I believe in Allah. And so I told him that hadith. I saw the inshirah in his heart. I saw it on his face. His whole face changed. And he said, Jazak Allah khayr, farajta anni. And he just said, Amantu billah. And that's the beauty of guidance. Like the Prophet's it's a very simple statement. But what the Prophet was essentially saying was, you can't think beyond the unthinkable. There's a famous mathematician called George Cantor. He has Cantor's theorem, which says that the whole can be greater than the part. Right? Well, Cantor believed that you could have an actual infinity, which Aristotle said you couldn't. And most mathematicians say you can't. So Cantor said if you have an actual infinity, the even numbers could be equal to the odd numbers. So he said, so the part can be equal to the whole. Right? That's Cantor's theory. Cantor ended up in a straitjacket, literally in an insane asylum. He went mad. Why? Because he contemplated infinity. The Prophet said, "La tafakkuru fillah." Do not think about God, but think about the gifts of God. Because if you start thinking about God, the word in Arabic, ilah, is from walaha, which is to bewilder or confuse. Right? You can't think about God. All you can think about is the attributes of God and the gifts of God. But to actually contemplate the essence of God is haram. It's just you can't do it because you will go mad.
This seems to get to the limitations of the rational mind. It certainly has its place and its function,
right.
But ultimately it's the heart that
that's
knows.
where that's where belief is. Yeah, I mean, look, scientists, they have belief too. They never talk about it. Their belief is in the order of the universe because all their science is based on the assumption that the universe is orderly, that these laws will actually work. I mean, Einstein, his laws, E equals mc squared, is based on the idea that you can measure energy, you can measure mass, and you can measure the constant, right? But what Einstein said is the only thing that he finds unintelligible about the universe is its intelligibility. That's somebody who, we know why it's intelligible because God made it to correspond with our minds. And that's why a believer's knowledge, irrespective of what faith you're in, and I'm not a perennialist, but irrespective of what faith you're in, you are advantaged over a materialistic scientist because all he can determine is how. We know why. And that's a great gift because why is at the essence, its purpose. Like, why are we here? Where did we come from? Where are we going? What's going to happen when we die? And one of the most amazing things about prophets is, unlike philosophers, every single philosopher that comes disagrees with his teacher. Every single one. Like Aristotle said about Plato, I love Plato, Plato's a friend, but the truth is a greater friend. So I have to disagree about these archetypes. Right? You look at every single one of them. They disagree with their teachers. With rare exception, I'm talking about the great philosophers. All the prophets say the same thing. Every single one of them. How did they do that? Why do they all say there's a day of judgment? Every Jewish prophet that came, none of them decided, oh, you know what? I disagree with Isaiah. None of them. And the Prophet ﷺ confirmed the previous revelations. Jesus said there's a day of judgment. He said you're going to be raised up. You're going to be resurrected. Moses said you're going to be resurrected. All of them said the same thing. The day of judgment is coming. So that's an amazing thing. So I think Muslims, we have to recognize what a gift we have. And then the other thing that we have, and again, people need solace. And religion is the essence of worldly solace. If you don't have religion, you're going to have to find something to opiate the pain of being in the dunya. And I just spoke to a lady today who's losing her 13-year-old child. This is dunya. This is a very difficult place to be in. And Allah says, وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِنَ الْخَوْفِ والجوع ونقص من الأموال والأنفس والثمرات وبشر الصابرين. We will test you with something of fear and hunger and loss of life and property. So give glad tidings to patient ones. Imam Zamakhshari in Al-Kashaf says, be shay'in, because whatever tribulation you have, it could be greater. You lost one child, you could have lost all your children. You lost one arm, you could have lost both arms. It could always be greater. But then he says, but Allah is warning you. وَلَا نَبْلُوَنَّ. We will test you. And so he's giving us a heads up that everything might be fine today, but you can wake up tomorrow with a diagnosis. And your iman has to be as strong, if not stronger, in that situation than it is today. But for people to say, people say, Dylan has a wonderful line. He said, you say you lost your faith. You know it's not like that. You had no faith to lose, and you know it. What is faith if you can lose it? And that's why this place is difficult. And religion is the necessary fentanyl to get you through the pain of this abode. But our Prophet told us, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that the person who had the most difficult life, the believer that had the most suffering in the world, will go into, there's a river, which is called the river of life in the afterlife. And you go into it, and you come out of it completely renewed. And that man will be asked, have you ever known suffering? And he will say, La wallahi, I never knew suffering. This is the one that for 60, 70, 80 years is now looking at infinity and in perfect bliss. And people say, the afterlife's a hype. Well, good luck. People have been saying that for a long time. We make a choice in this dunya to believe or disbelieve. فَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيُؤْمِنْ وَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيَكْفُرْ. Whoever wants to believe, let him believe. Whoever wants to disbelieve, let him disbelieve. You have a choice, but just know the choice is going to have consequences. It's a long answer to a short question.
No,
I apologize.
It's brilliant. I'd like to ask just two other quick questions related to your response. Do you see a harmony that can be established, as there was in classical Islamic history, between faith and philosophy, between, for example, Abu Hamid Ghazali's Mishkat al-Anwar and Suhrawardi's Hikmat al-Ishraq? There seems to be a connection. There were philosophers, people of faith, who based their writings upon the Quran and the writings of the theologians.
I mean, first of all, I would say that Allah has created a creation. Your endeavors on this planet are diverse. There's all these different people. There are very simple people, and those people actually are lucky. Simple faith. This is a famous Fakhruddin al-Razi was walking once with all these students in his trail, and this old woman saw him, and she asked one of the students, "Who's that?" Because she's amazed all these followers. He looks, he said, "Astaghfirullah, you don't know, that's Fakhruddin al-Razi. He has 70 proofs for the existence of God." And she said, if he didn't have 70 doubts, he wouldn't need 70 proofs. And when Fakhruddin heard that, he said, "Alaykum bi iman al-ajaiz." Have the faith of old women. That's real faith, right? And so there's a great blessing. You should never belittle simple people, because some of the most beautiful followers of the Prophet were simple people, like that woman who used to sweep or firfira. Firfira. Does anybody know who that is? Firfira. Sometimes it's called kirkira. Does anybody know who kirkira was? Nobody? Wow, man, you guys should know these people. Kirkira an-Nubi. He was one of the servants of the Prophet ﷺ. He loved the Prophet ﷺ. Do you know who Safina was? Safina, Mawla Rasulillah. He was a servant of the Prophet ﷺ. He was a freed slave, and he served the Prophet. And he tells, this is a true story, he tells that he got lost in a forest, and a lion came and was about to attack him. And he says, "Wayhaka, watch out." He said, "Ana Safina Mawla Rasulillah." I'm Safina, the servant of the Prophet Muhammad. And he said that the lion, he said he came up and started nudging him, and then he walked him through, and he warned any animal that threatened him until he got him out. And then he said when he said that, he wagged his tail as if he was acknowledging it. And then when he left, he said the lion humhama, like as if kanahu wada'ani, as if he was saying goodbye to me. And we have many examples of that from Sahaba. So these are simple people that had profound faith. But you also have Einsteins. You have people like Richard Feynman, who are thinking about some of the most abstract things on the planet. Religion has to encompass the whole spectrum. It's not a true religion if it can't satisfy the most brilliant people and the simplest people. And that's the genius of our religion. And this is why I'll give you one example of this. Bruno Guerdadoni, all right? Bruno Guerdadoni is in the top 10 cosmologists on the planet. He's a physicist, astrophysicist, which is our highest material science, astrophysics. You can't get any higher than astrophysics. He's an astrophysicist. He was actually responsible for looking at background radiation and analyzing background radiation from the edges of the universe. I read an article about him in the Herald Tribune. And in that book, and in that article, he talked about how, as a cosmologist, he looks at the universe as signs that need to be interpreted. And I was thinking, he should read the Quran. So then when I Googled him, I found out he had become Muslim in France. And this man has over 100 peer-reviewed papers on galaxy formation, right? I mean, he's really one of the top scientists in the world. And we almost had him at Harvard, and Harvard was so excited about getting him. We were going to do a thing, because I corresponded with him. But he said in one paper, he said, as a scientist, I had to be true to my intellect. And he said, but as a believer, I also had to satisfy my heart. And he said, I found Islam was the only religion that could do that for me. That it didn't negate my intellect, and it asserted my heart. And so philosophy, the Muslims, philosophy is dangerous because if you're not grounded in tradition well, and you go into philosophy first, you can really get confused. Especially modern philosophy, because a lot of modern philosophy is very atheistic, and these poor students go into university courses and take these courses in philosophy. And these guys are powerful sophists that really know how to argue and confuse people. But philosophy as a subject in the Islamic tradition is essential to the religion, because in having a metaphysical foundation for your religion, you can defend it in a way that can't be defended without that foundation when great, what they call obfuscations or shubuhat come. And in losing philosophers, we lose defenders of the faith. And then the defense becomes the bludgeon. It just becomes the hammer, which is no defense. So you need philosophy to be part of the. And I just literally today I sent to Ustad Abdullah Ali. Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya was interviewed on Sky News, and the interviewer, who was from the Gulf, one of the Gulf states, he said, Sheikh, you're always quoting philosophers that some ulama say philosophy is haram. And he said philosophy is hikmah. And he said philosophers are men, and they sometimes have wisdom that we can benefit from. And he said, the Prophet ﷺ said, al-hikmatu dallatul mu'min. Wisdom is the lost property of the believer. Wherever he finds it, he has more right to it. And so there's great wisdom in philosophy. There's great wisdom in poetry. I mean, poetry is one of the great art forms of Muslims. And that's why people like Amir Suleiman are so important, because that art form it's a sign that we're maintaining our humanity. If you have a culture that doesn't have poets, you're in big trouble. Really, because poets, what they're doing is they're using language as the art form, and language is the highest thing that we have as a species. And this is why the Quran is words. And there are many beautiful art forms, but we share those art forms with most other creatures. I mean, beavers build extraordinary dams that are a marvel to look at. Bees make beautiful works of art. They're tessellated honeycombs, beautiful hexagrams. But the poet his art form is the gift that God gave us. Ar-Rahman, Allamahu al-Bayan. He taught human beings how to articulate. And this is the great gift. And that's why our community was always a community of language. And you cannot understand language at the deepest levels without having a philosophical foundation for the languages, which is why we had great grammarians, we had great rhetoricians, and if you study them, they were profound philosophers of language, really. And Noam Chomsky's coming next week. And if you're here, is it next week?
He'll be here October 26th.
Ask him about the Arab grammarians, because Noam Chomsky knows Arabic. And there's a Palestinian Arab who wrote a PhD dissertation, which I read. Dr. Omar had, I gave it to Dr. Omar. The PhD dissertation showing that a lot of his theories were actually preceded by Iraqi grammarians in the 4th century. Right, yeah. So, yeah, and metaphysics is the first science because it's the science of first principles. And you have to have a metaphysical foundation. The Quran has many metaphysical implications, but because it's a revelation, it's not a book of philosophy, but embedded in it is a metaphysical perspective that has to be drawn out. And I'll just, to give you one example, there are 2 ways to look at the world. One is that the world is evil by its nature, and there's all these horrible things that happen in the world. And the other is to see the world as a testing ground for your own spiritual growth. Because things are going to happen that are very troubling in your life. But the Quranic perspective is that he does these things in order for you to grow. And so the believer grows by it, and the disbeliever is stunted by it. And that's the difference. That's a metaphysical understanding that if you don't have that, the world will confuse you to no end.
Thank you for that, Shaykh Hamza. The last, I'll just briefly ask one last question, and I think you've alluded to this in your talk. But how would the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, respond to some of the challenges that we're facing right now in the United States? Racism, sexism, tribalism, but in particular war as well, which I think is at the root of a lot of our problems. Wars abroad. How can we grow as a community here while at the same time being concerned about what's happening overseas?
I mean, first of all, the Christians have this thing, what would Jesus do? Like, that's a evangelical principle. They always ask, what would Jesus do in this situation? We know what the Prophet ﷺ would do in any given situation because no prophet is more detailed historically than our prophet. So we know how he dealt with all these various situations that he found himself in. And I would argue, one, that the Prophet ﷺ dealt with all the major human problems that we should be concerned with in the farewell address. The farewell address, which is recorded in a few different iterations, but essentially deals with economic injustice, which is based on usury. And usury is one of the biggest problems on the planet, and nobody wants to talk about it. It's just amazing. The second was racism. He dealt with racism. And what's amazing about that hadith is he said, لا فضل لعربي على عجمي ولا لعجم على عربي ولا لأسود على أبيض ولا لأبيض على أسود إلا بتقوى. What really struck me about that hadith is he did not collectivize. He said there's no preference of an Arab individual over a non-Arab individual. And there's no preference of a non-Arab individual over. He didn't say لا فضل للعرب على العجم. He did not collectivize. He brought it down to where the problem is, in the individual heart. And this is, we will not get rid of racism until we recognize that this is an individual problem. It can have collective realities when large groups are racist. So it does have, but always within those groups are good people. So in the history of America, you have constantly white Americans that were fighting against racism, many of them having terrible lives because of it. Just horrible lives. And you've always had those people. And then you've had the fence sitters, and then you had the people that were just clearly wrong. But if you collectivize, it's a crime against those individuals amongst that group. And that's why the Quran always, it talks about Bani Israel, it says, minhum min mu'minun, laysu sawa min ahl al-kitab. It's always giving you, look, there's people among them that are good. There's people among them that are decent. Don't collectivize them. So
there's the Quakers,
the
John
Amish,
Brown,
all these people, John Brown,
gave his life.
Exactly. So this is really important. Then he said there's no preference of a white man over a black man or a black man over a white man. He went both ways. He didn't just say, because the problem then was, the white against the black. That's been the problem on this planet for a long time. Color is, varna in Hindu, which means caste system, means color in Sanskrit. So this has been a human problem for a long time on this planet. And you will find in many, many cultures, before the Europeans ever showed up on the historical scene, this problem existed. And it's an ibtila. It's an ibtila in many cultures. But the ibtila is a test to see what you're made of, what's your metal. And we have people that, despite everything, just did amazing things. So he dealt with racism, and racism, the word ansariya is a modern word in Arabic. Racism is a species of arrogance. It's kibr. The real disease is arrogance, to think you're better than another person, especially for something as stupid as the color of your skin. I mean, that's just stupid. It really is. And then you have, it's just crazy. You've got these white people that do all these things to turn brown. And then you've got black people doing all these things to turn white. I don't know, it's very odd. But that is just this is called an accident in philosophy. It's not an essence, it's not an essential quality. Because it can change. I can go out in the sun and turn dark. And somebody who has black skin can literally lose their pigmentation and turn white. Does that change their essence? No. And so that's where Islam looks at the essence of people and what's the quality of, the content of their character. What are they made of? And the beautiful hadith of Abu Dharr al-Ghifari, when he called, some say it was Bilal, it's different in the riwayat, but he said, Ya bin as-Sawda, which is almost like using the N-word for the Arabs, But what the Prophet said to him, to me, is very profound. He said, Anta imru'un fika jahiliya. You're a man who still has some jahiliya in him. He didn't say you're evil. He said, you've got something to work on. You haven't gotten this religion yet, if you've still got that. But he recognized him as a believer. So there people have things to do. We're evolving. And we have to allow for people to evolve. The idea that somebody was a racist 30 years ago and that means he's a racist today, that's criminal. It's criminal because people evolve. And so that's it. And then he dealt with sexism. And he said, your women are in a compromised situation. And women are compromised. People don't like that fact. But when societies break down, it's the women that suffer. You look at the Yazidi women, they were just dragged off. The men were killed and the women were dragged off. You look at the sexual things that are happening. So most women are physically weaker than men, and that's why rape occurs far more often against women for that reason, because it's hard for them to fight off a strong man. And there's women that could throw me up on that mat there and knock me out and do it. That's true. But we're talking about the vast majority of women are compromised physically, so they can be overwhelmed by a man physically. And that's why men have to be taught to honor women and to be chivalrous. And these ideas of removing this from culture is very dangerous. This whole modern movement against masculinity is very dangerous, because masculinity, there's a reason why men are meant to have masculinity. It's to protect and defend. These are important qualities, and this idea of just removing that from society, it's anti-fitra, and it belies inherent impulses in the most noble qualities of human beings. So, but we should see the equality of men and women before the law, before God. And intellectually, there are many women that are far smarter than most men, and vice versa. It goes both ways. Intellect is very close. The difference between male intelligence and female intelligence, by and large, is negligible. It really is, and that's been proven. Women are perfectly competent at learning anything that the vast majority of men can do. There is, however, a very small select group of mathematical geniuses that tend to be male. That's just a fact. That in spatial reasoning, you have a very small select group. But that's not men. That's just a select group. I mean, they're literally could probably fit into this room on the planet. So what, men go around boasting we're smarter than women because of that? It's just stupid. You know, these are stupid.
Be the ones that go insane thinking about infinity.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and then finally, the last thing in that farewell address was he talked about the manipulation of nature, which was the intercalation. You know, taking the natural order of the calendar and changing it. And manipulation of nature is another threat to our species, what we're doing now with all these manipulating genetics and things like that. So I think he summed up all the major problems on the planet: economic injustice, which is class warfare; racial injustice, which is racial warfare; and then gender injustice, which leads to gender warfare. And we have to avoid these wars, because they're not wars we want to fight. They're wars we want to prevent. And we can only prevent them by bringing these prophetic truths and getting larger and larger numbers of people to commit to them.